A homeless boy approaches a wealthy CEO, clutching a simple necklace and saying, "My dad gave me this." The CEO freezes, staring at the necklace as her heart shatters. It's not just any necklace. It's the exact design her late husband made decades ago for their unborn daughter. How did this boy get it? Could it really be connected to her past? And when the boy's story unfolds, it reveals a heartbreaking secret that will change everything she thought she knew about her family, her late husband, and herself. Don't miss this gripping tale of love, loss, and an unexpected bond that will leave you breathless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Grace Mitchell stood at the entrance of the Mitchell Memorial Foundation, taking in the fresh spring air. Cherry blossoms dotted the streets of downtown Portland, their pink petals dancing in the morning breeze. She pulled her light jacket closer, more out of habit than necessity. The glass doors slid open with a gentle whoosh. Inside, the foundation's modern lobby buzzed with quiet activity. Grace nodded at Sarah, the receptionist, who brightened at her arrival. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes, lovely," Grace replied with a polite smile, already moving toward the elevator. She appreciated her staff's warmth but preferred to keep to herself, especially on mornings like this when memories weighed heavily on her mind. In her office, Grace settled into the familiar routine of organizing files and reviewing documents. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow across her desk. Her eyes drifted to the silver-framed photograph that held pride of place beside her computer. Martin's kind eyes looked back at her, his smile as gentle as she remembered. The photo had been taken at their last anniversary dinner, just months before the heart attack that took him away. 5 years had passed, but the ache in her chest felt as fresh as ever. "I miss you," she whispered, touching the frame lightly before turning to her work. The morning slipped away as Grace reviewed scholarship applications. Each story of struggle and hope reminded her of her own journey, the success she'd achieved as CEO of a major corporation, balanced against the personal losses that had shaped her life. The stillbirth of their daughter, Emily, had left a void that even Martin's love couldn't fully heal. Now, with both of them gone, Grace found purpose but little joy in her structured days. At noon, Grace gathered her things for a lunch meeting with a potential donor. As she stepped outside, movement caught her eye. A small figure sat cross-legged on the sidewalk, a careful arrangement of handmade items spread before him on a blue cloth. The boy couldn't have been more than 11. Despite the warming spring day, he wore an oversized gray hoodie that seemed to swallow his slight frame. His hands moved carefully, adjusting what looked like handcrafted bracelets and small decorative pieces. Grace slowed her steps, studying him. There was something in the way he handled his creations, with pride and care, that tugged at her heart. But years of maintaining professional distance made her hesitate. The boy glanced up, revealing a face that held both youth and a peculiar maturity. "It's really none of my business," Grace murmured to herself, checking her watch. The donor was waiting, and she prided herself on punctuality. She quickened her pace toward the cafe down the block, but each step felt heavier than the last. Inside the cafe, Grace claimed a window seat while waiting for her appointment. She found her gaze drawn back to the boy outside. People streamed past him, eyes forward, phones in hand, none sparing a glance for his careful display. As she watched, he began slowly packing his trinkets away, his shoulders slumped but his movements still gentle with his creations. A familiar unease settled in her stomach, the same feeling she got whenever she chose practicality over connection. Grace forced her attention to her meeting notes, but her thoughts kept drifting to the boy outside, alone on the bustling street. The next morning's air felt crisp and clean as Grace pulled into her usual parking spot behind the foundation building. She was early. The sun had barely climbed over Portland's eastern skyline. As she gathered her belongings from the passenger seat, movement caught her eye. The boy from yesterday was already there, carefully arranging his handmade trinkets on a small folding table. Grace sat in her car for a moment, watching him through the windshield. His movements were precise and careful, treating each piece like a treasure. Something about his dedication touched her heart. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her purse and walked over. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. The boy looked up, surprise flickering across his young face. "Oh, hi," he replied, straightening up. His oversized hoodie hung loose on his thin frame. "I'm Grace. I work in the building here." She gestured toward the foundation. "Those look interesting. Did you make them yourself?" A small smile brightened his features. "Yeah, I'm Aaron. My mom gets the supplies from thrift stores, beads and wire and stuff. I put them together after school." Grace bent down to examine the display. Each piece showed remarkable attention to detail. Bracelets woven with colorful beads, simple pendants hanging from leather cords. "These are quite lovely," she said honestly. Aaron reached under his collar and pulled out a silver necklace. "This one's special, though. My dad gave it to me before." His voice trailed off, but he held it up proudly. "It's not for sale." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The pendant, a delicate spiral of silver wire forming an abstract heart shape with a small crystal at its center, was identical to one Martin had designed years ago. She remembered watching him craft it in his workshop, pouring his love and grief into every twist of wire. It was meant to be a gift for their daughter, who never drew her first breath. That's beautiful," Grace managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where did your father get it?" "He made it," Aaron said softly, running his thumb over the design. "Before the accident at the factory. It's all I have left of him now." Grace's mind whirled with questions, but she forced herself to focus on the present moment. "I'd like to buy one of your pieces," she said, selecting a simple beaded bracelet. "And would you consider selling the necklace?" Aaron clutched it protectively. "Oh no, I couldn't sell this, but you can have it if you want. You seem nice." "That's very generous, but I insist on paying for it." Grace pulled out her wallet, noting Aaron's worn sneakers and the frayed edges of his hoodie. "Really, it's okay," Aaron protested, but Grace was firm. "Please," she said, holding out several bills. "I'd be honored to have it." After some gentle persuasion, Aaron accepted the money. "Would you like to get some lunch?" Grace offered, but Aaron shook his head. "Thanks, but I need to get going soon, maybe another time." Back in her office, Grace sat at her desk, the necklace cool against her palm. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, every curve and twist exactly as she remembered Martin creating it. She held it up to the light, watching the crystal catch the morning sun. "It can't be the same, can it?" she whispered to the empty room. Grace's footsteps echoed through her empty house as she made her way to her study after a simple dinner of soup and bread. The room still held traces of Martin. His presence lingered in every corner, from the organized chaos of his drafting table to the walls lined with his framed designs. Even his favorite coffee mug sat untouched on the windowsill, gathering dust in the fading evening light. She switched on the antique desk lamp, casting a warm glow across the room. With trembling hands, she reached for a carved wooden box on the highest shelf. It was where she kept Martin's most personal sketches and designs, things too precious to display but too painful to look at regularly. The box's familiar weight in her hands brought back countless memories of watching him work. The box creaked open, revealing carefully preserved papers. Her fingers brushed past various sketches until she found what she was looking for, the original design for their daughter's necklace. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but Martin's precise line work remained clear and beautiful. His distinctive signature graced the bottom corner, along with the date he'd completed the design. Grace placed Aaron's necklace beside the sketch on her desk. Her breath caught in her throat. The resemblance wasn't just close, it was exact. Every curve, every delicate spiral, even the unique way the silver strands intertwined matched perfectly. She traced the design with her finger, remembering how Martin had described each element's meaning. The spiral for life's journey, the intertwined strands for family bonds, the small crystal at the center representing hope. His voice echoed in her memory, passionate and clear as he'd explained each detail. "This can't be coincidence," she whispered to herself. Her mind raced back to that day years ago when Martin had proudly shown her the design. He'd been so excited, spending weeks perfecting every detail. It was meant to be unique, their special gift for the daughter they never got to meet. She remembered how he'd sketched version after version until he felt it was perfect. Tears welled in her eyes as the memories washed over her, the nursery they'd painted together, the tiny clothes they'd chosen, the devastating stillness in the delivery room. Martin had placed the necklace in this very box afterward, unable to look at it again. The pain had been too raw, too deep for both of them. Grace wiped her eyes and turned to her computer. She spent the next hour searching through jewelry databases and design archives, looking for anything similar to Martin's creation. But there was nothing. No mass-produced versions, no similar patterns. The design appeared to be completely unique. Each search result only confirmed what she already knew. This was Martin's work, through and through. She sat back in her chair, mind whirling with questions. How did Erin's father get this necklace? Why did Martin never mention sharing the design? What other secrets might her husband have kept? The questions seemed to multiply with each passing moment. Standing up, Grace walked to Martin's old drafting table and ran her hand along its worn surface. The familiar scratches and dents beneath her fingers brought fresh tears to her eyes. She picked up the necklace and returned to her desk, placing it carefully beside the original sketch. The lamplight caught the silver, making it shimmer like starlight against the aged paper. "I don't know what you've left me, Martin," she whispered, "but I need to find out." Her words hung in the quiet room, heavy with determination and an underlying hint of fear at what she might discover. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Grace approached Erin, who was carefully arranging his handmade trinkets on a small folding table. His face brightened with recognition when he saw her, his nimble fingers pausing over a collection of colorful beaded necklaces. "Good morning, Erin," Grace said warmly, admiring his artistic display. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for lunch today." Erin's hands fidgeted with a wire bracelet, twisting it back and forth nervously. "My mom says I shouldn't talk to strangers," he replied, but his eyes showed interest, darting between Grace and his crafts. "That's very wise of your mom," Grace nodded approvingly. "I work right here at the foundation." She gestured to the brick building behind them with its gleaming windows. "I'm Grace Mitchell." After a moment's consideration, Erin carefully packed his trinkets into a worn backpack, each piece wrapped with obvious care. "Okay, Mrs. Mitchell. There's a diner around the corner that makes good grilled cheese. They even cut the crusts off if you ask." The bell above the diner door chimed cheerfully as they entered. In the worn vinyl booth, Erin seemed to relax, his shoulders dropping from their usual tense position as he sank into the familiar red cushions. Over steaming plates of grilled cheese and tomato soup, the rich aroma of melted butter filling the air, he began to open up. "Dad died 2 years ago," Erin said quietly, stirring his soup with slow, deliberate movements. "There was an accident at the factory where he worked. Mom tries really hard, but sometimes it's tough. We had to move to a smaller place." Grace listened intently as Erin described his mother Rachel's late-night cleaning jobs and her determination to keep their family afloat. His voice swelled with emotion as he spoke. "She's really strong," Erin added proudly, dunking his sandwich in the soup. "But she doesn't like asking anyone for help. Says we've got to stand on our own 2 feet." After lunch, they walked several blocks to a modest apartment building with peeling paint and window boxes filled with struggling petunias. Erin led Grace up to the 3rd floor where he knocked on apartment 3C, the brass numbers slightly tarnished. Rachel Carter opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to concern when she saw Grace. She was wearing simple work clothes, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite her obvious fatigue, she stood tall and straight. "Mom, this is Mrs. Mitchell," Erin explained quickly, bouncing slightly on his toes. "She works at the foundation down the street." "Grace Mitchell." Grace extended her hand with a gentle smile. "I met Erin outside our building and thought he might like some lunch. He's quite the artist." Rachel shook her hand firmly but briefly, her calloused palm betraying years of hard work. "That's very kind of you," she said, her tone polite but reserved. "Erin, homework time." As Aaron disappeared inside, Grace noticed a framed photo on the wall behind Rachel. It showed a man with Aaron's same gentle eyes and warm smile, and something about his face made Grace's heart skip a beat. She tried to keep her voice steady as she explained about the foundation and meeting Aaron, but Rachel's responses remained short and careful, her arms crossed protectively. "We appreciate the lunch," Rachel said finally, shifting her weight. "But we're managing just fine on our own. We always have." Grace nodded, understanding the pride in Rachel's voice and the protective stance of a mother who'd weathered many storms. As she turned to leave, she took one last look at the apartment door closing behind her, feeling an inexplicable pull toward this small family and their story. Something about them awakened memories she'd long kept buried, and questions she couldn't quite ignore. Grace's heels echoed through the empty foundation building as she made her way to the archive room. The photo of Thomas Carter she'd seen on Rachel's mantle haunted her thoughts. Something about his eyes and the way he held himself reminded her eerily of her late husband, Martin. Entering the archive room, Grace was greeted by the familiar scent of old paper and dust. Flicking on the fluorescent lights, she was met with rows of metal filing cabinets containing decades of Mitchell Enterprises history. Tracing the labels, she quickly found the employee records from Martin's time as CEO. "It has to be here somewhere," she muttered, pulling out drawer after drawer in search of any information about Thomas Carter. After an hour of diligent searching, she finally located a thin folder labeled Carter Thomas. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she opened the file, only to find surprisingly sparse information, just basic employment details and dates. Thomas had worked as a factory floor supervisor for 6 months before suddenly departing, with no exit interview, formal resignation letter, or more than a brief note marking his last day. "This isn't right," Grace said to herself, perplexed. Martin had always been meticulous about documentation, and every employee file she'd seen contained detailed records, performance reviews, and correspondence. This file felt deliberately and suspiciously empty. As she continued to dig deeper into the cabinet, a yellowed envelope caught her eye. Written in Martin's familiar scrawl were the words, "Personal Matter, T. Carter." Grace's heart raced as she pulled it out, but inside she found only a single vague memo page with no real substance. Sitting back in her chair, Grace's mind whirled with questions. In all their years together, Martin had never mentioned Thomas Carter. Yet something about this felt significant. Important enough for Martin to keep separate from regular records, but vague enough to raise more questions than answers. Reaching for her phone, Grace dialed a number she hadn't used in months. "Paul, it's Grace Mitchell. I need your help with something." "Yes, it's personal this time. How soon can you meet?" After arranging to meet Paul Turner the next day, Grace returned to her office, pulling out her leather-bound journal, a habit she'd maintained since Martin's death, and began to write. Something doesn't add up. The necklace, Thomas's photo, these strange, incomplete records. Martin was keeping secrets, but why? What was so important about Thomas Carter that required such careful handling? She paused, touching the delicate silver necklace that now lay on her desk. "Martin," she whispered into the quiet room. "What were you hiding?" Grace sat on the concrete steps outside the foundation, watching Aaron's face light up as she handed him the wrapped package. His fingers trembled slightly as he carefully undid the brown paper, treating each fold with reverence as if it were made of delicate silk. "For me?" he asked, his eyes widening at the sight of the pristine sketchbook and professional colored pencils. The afternoon sun caught the metallic details on the pencil case, making them sparkle. "I noticed how you're always doodling on scraps of paper," Grace said warmly. "I thought you might like something proper to draw in. These are the same brand I used to buy for my husband." Aaron ran his hand over the notebook's smooth cover, tracing the embossed pattern with his fingertips. "This is amazing," he whispered, already flipping to the first clean page. His pencil moved with surprising confidence across the paper, making soft scratching sounds in the quiet afternoon air. Grace watched in comfortable silence as shapes began to emerge. Aaron's natural talent was obvious in every stroke, reminding her of Martin's own artistic gift. His small hands moved with purpose, creating clean lines and deliberate curves that seemed beyond his years. "What do you want to be when you grow up, Aaron?" Grace asked softly, genuinely curious about his dreams. He paused his sketching, looking up with bright eyes that held both hope and determination. "An architect or designer? Maybe both. I love making things beautiful. Dad used to say that beauty makes people happy." "Would you like to see inside the foundation?" Grace offered, standing up and brushing off her slacks. "I could show you where I work." Aaron nodded eagerly, carefully tucking his new supplies into his worn but well-cared-for backpack. Inside her office, Grace pulled out some foundation budget sheets, seeing an opportunity to connect. "Here's something every designer needs to know," she said, turning the papers into a game about managing money. Aaron caught on quickly, asking thoughtful questions that showed wisdom beyond his years. As they worked, Aaron absently sketched in his new notebook, his hand moving almost unconsciously across the page. Grace glanced over and froze. There on the paper was a design eerily similar to Martin's necklace pattern, complete with the same flowing curves and intricate details. Her heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. "That's beautiful," she said, accepting the drawing when Aaron offered it to her with a shy smile. "Mom says I shouldn't spend too much time with people I don't know," Aaron admitted suddenly, looking down at his scuffed shoes and fidgeting with his pencil. Grace touched his shoulder gently, understanding his mother's protective instincts. "You're helping me, too. I feel like I learn more from you every day." Aaron's face brightened like a sun breaking through clouds. He flipped through his notebook, showing Grace several new designs he'd already created. The pages were filled with intricate patterns and architectural drawings that showed remarkable promise for someone so young, each one revealing a fresh aspect of his creative mind. "You have a real gift, Aaron," Grace said sincerely, watching his eyes shine with pride at her genuine praise. She could see echoes of Martin's talent in every line the boy drew. The evening sun cast long shadows across the worn apartment building as Grace stood outside Rachel's door, gathering her courage. She could hear Aaron's excited voice through the door, presumably telling his mother about their afternoon together. His words tumbled out in an enthusiastic rush, making Grace smile despite her nerves. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. Rachel opened the door, her expression guarded but softening slightly when she saw Aaron's beaming face behind Grace. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at long hours of work. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "Aaron hasn't stopped talking about the art supplies. He's already sketched half a notebook full." The small apartment was meticulously clean, despite its dated furnishings. A few carefully mended patches on the couch cushions spoke of Rachel's determination to maintain appearances. Grace settled onto the edge of a faded armchair while Rachel perched on the couch, her posture tense, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to discuss something with you," Grace began carefully, choosing her words with deliberate precision. "The foundation has an opening for a part-time administrative position. The hours would be during school and the pay is competitive." She watched Rachel's face, noting the slight widening of her eyes. "It would give you more time with Aaron." Rachel's fingers twisted in her lap, her wedding ring catching the last rays of sunlight through the window. "That's, very kind of you." Her voice was measured, controlled, like someone walking on thin ice. "But I can't accept." "May I ask why?" "I've learned the hard way that people don't give without expecting something in return." Rachel's words came out sharp, but Grace heard the pain beneath them, raw and familiar. Grace nodded slowly. "You've done an amazing job raising Aaron on your own. The strength that takes... I admire that. Not everyone could manage what you've accomplished." Something in Rachel's expression shifted, a hairline crack in her careful facade. She glanced at the photo of Thomas on the mantel, his smile frozen in time behind dusty glass. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted quietly. "Aaron needs stability. I worry about him getting attached to people who..." She trailed off, leaving unspoken fears hanging in the air between them. "I'm not going anywhere," Grace said firmly, meeting Rachel's gaze. Rachel was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the couch fabric. Thomas was like that too, kind to everyone, but he carried so much inside. She touched her wedding ring absently, a habit worn smooth by time. There were things he never shared, burdens he wouldn't let me help with. Sometimes I'd find him just staring at nothing, lost in thought, like he was carrying the weight of the world. Grace watched as Rachel straightened a stack of Aaron's school books, her movements precise and careful, almost ritualistic. "I keep his memory alive for Aaron," Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He needs to know his father was a good man despite—" She stopped herself, biting back words that seemed to pain her. As Grace gathered her purse to leave, the strap cool against her palm, she overheard Rachel's soft words to Aaron in the kitchen. "You can trust her, but don't get too attached." The boy's silence spoke volumes. The words followed Grace down the stairs and into her car, echoing with all the weight of Rachel's carefully constructed walls, built brick by brick from years of disappointment and loss. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds of Grace's office as she waited for Paul Turner. Her fingers drummed nervously on her desk, creating a steady rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. The familiar scent of coffee lingered in the air from her third cup that day, a testament to her mounting anxiety. When Paul finally arrived, his weathered face bore the serious expression she'd come to recognize from years of working together, and his typically neat tie was slightly askew. "What did you find?" Grace asked, gesturing for him to sit in one of the leather chairs facing her desk. Paul placed a thick manila folder on her desk, its edges worn from frequent handling. "Thomas Carter wasn't who he claimed to be," he said, opening the file with careful precision. "He worked at Mitchell Enterprises under the name Thomas Wilson, changed his name right before he started. The paperwork was filed just weeks before his employment began." Grace leaned forward, studying the documents Paul spread before her. Employee photos, newspaper clippings, and official records painted a complex picture of a man she'd never met, but who now seemed inexplicably connected to her life. Her reading glasses slipped down her nose as she examined each piece of evidence. "There's more," Paul continued, pulling out a yellowed newspaper article, its edges crumbling slightly. "Found this from about 15 years ago. Thomas was involved in some kind of legal battle with his previous employer, but the details are sealed. Whatever happened, it was serious enough that he wanted to hide his identity. The court documents are locked tight." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the article, the paper crackling beneath her fingers. "And the factory accident?" "On paper, it's straightforward. Wrong place, wrong time. But here's where it gets interesting." Paul pulled out another document, this one crisp and official-looking. The factory owner, James Henderson, was a regular business partner of Martin's. They had several joint ventures together, including 3 major development projects in the last decade. Grace sat back in her chair, processing this information. The connection seemed too coincidental to ignore. The leather creaked as she shifted her weight. "Could you find anything else about his relationship with Martin?" Paul shook his head, his expression grim. "Not yet, but I'll keep digging. Someone this careful about hiding their identity usually leaves traces somewhere. People like that tend to slip up eventually." That evening, after Paul left, Grace sat at her desk writing in her journal. The words flowed quickly as she tried to make sense of everything she'd learned, her pen scratching against the paper in the growing darkness. "Thomas Carter, who were you really? What made you hide your identity? And Martin, did you know? Were you protecting him, or was there something else? The pieces are there, but I can't see the full picture yet." She picked up Thomas's photo from the file, studying his face in the warm glow of her desk lamp. The same gentle eyes she saw in Aaron looked back at her, holding secrets she was only beginning to uncover. "I need to know who you really were, and what you meant to Martin," she whispered to the photograph, her voice barely audible in the quiet office. The clock on her wall ticked steadily, marking time as another piece of the puzzle settled into place. The morning sun cast long shadows across Grace's dining room table, where papers and folders lay scattered like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. Steam rose from her coffee cup, untouched and growing cold as she immersed herself in Martin's old documents. Each yellowed page held potential answers, but so far they only led to more questions. Her reading glasses sat perched on the edge of her nose as she squinted at the fading ink on decades-old receipts and letters. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for another stack of papers from Martin's office. A cream-colored envelope slipped free, falling onto her lap. The words, "Family Matters," were written in Martin's neat handwriting across the front. The envelope was sealed, its edges slightly yellow with age, with a small coffee stain in one corner. Grace picked it up, her heart quickening. She ran her finger along the sealed edge, hesitating. Opening it felt like crossing a line, but she needed answers. The paper crackled beneath her touch, brittle with time. With a deep breath, she broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper, careful not to tear the delicate edges. The note was brief, dated 15 years ago. Martin's familiar handwriting filled just half the page, the blue ink slightly faded, but still clearly legible. "I made this choice to protect our family's legacy. Some burdens we carry alone, not because we don't trust those we love, but because we love them too much to share the weight. Forgive me." Grace closed her eyes, remembering that period. Martin had grown distant, spending long hours at work, coming home later and later each night. When she'd ask what was wrong, he'd smile and say everything was fine, but his eyes told a different story. Dark circles beneath them, worry lines etched deeper than before. She'd given him space, believing he'd open up when ready. Now she wondered if that had been a mistake. Her hands shaking, she reached for her phone and dialed Paul's number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice crisp and professional even at this early hour. "Paul, I need you to focus on something specific," she said, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. "Look for any direct connection between Thomas Carter and Martin. Personal relationships, meetings, anything that goes beyond just work. Check old calendars, appointment books, anything you can find." "You found something?" Paul asked, curiosity evident in his tone. "Maybe. Just dig deeper. Please. And Paul, this stays between us for now." After hanging up, Grace returned to the files with renewed determination. She found scattered references that seemed innocent at first glance, notes about handling the situation and addressing the conflict. But now, with the morning's discovery, each vague mention felt weighted with hidden meaning, like coded messages she should have seen years ago. She picked up a framed photo of Martin from the table, wiping away a thin layer of dust with her thumb. His smile, usually so comforting, now seemed to hide secrets she'd never noticed before. The corners of his eyes held a sadness she hadn't recognized at the time. "What did you do, Martin?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the quiet room. "What were you trying to protect us from?" Grace stood on Rachel's doorstep, clutching a brown paper bag filled with groceries. Her knuckles whitened as she knocked, knowing this conversation wouldn't be easy. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the maple tree in the yard, making her shiver slightly. The door opened slowly, and Rachel's tired eyes met hers, dark circles beneath them telling their own story of sleepless nights. "I brought some things," Grace said softly, lifting the bag. "Just basics, bread, milk, some fresh vegetables, and I picked up some of that cereal Aaron likes." Rachel's shoulders tensed, but after a moment she stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aaron's at the library. He's working on a science project." The apartment was small but meticulously clean, with worn but well cared for furniture. A familiar scent of lemon cleaner hung in the air. Grace followed Rachel to the tiny kitchen, where a stack of unpaid bills sat prominently on the counter, their red past due stamps visible even from across the room. Rachel quickly shuffled them away, tucking them into a drawer. "Rachel?" Grace began carefully, setting the groceries down on the scratched laminate countertop. "I need to ask you about Thomas's time at Mitchell Enterprises. Do you know why he left so suddenly?" Rachel's hands stilled as she was putting away the groceries, a can of soup frozen halfway to the cabinet. She turned slowly, leaning against the counter for support, her fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. "I wondered when you'd ask about that," she said, her voice strained with emotion. "Thomas, Rachel paused, choosing her words carefully, her gaze fixed on the linoleum floor. He carried a lot of pain. He felt like society had turned its back on him. The jobs, the people who hired him. He said they all looked down on him, called him worthless. Grace noticed Rachel's hands trembling slightly as she pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. He mentioned your family specifically, Rachel continued, her words coming faster now. He'd get so angry sometimes talking about the Mitchells. His face would turn red and he'd pace the floor for hours, but he never explained why, just that you, had something to do with his struggles. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, making them shine in the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window. I kept quiet because I was ashamed. Aaron adores you, and I didn't want this darkness from the past to hurt his chances. The foundation has been so good to him, he's finally starting to believe in himself again. It won't, Grace assured her gently, resisting the urge to reach out and touch Rachel's arm. Aaron's future is what matters most to me too. Nothing will change that. Rachel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a slight smudge of mascara. Thomas taught Aaron to never give up, to keep fighting no matter what. But he was bitter. He mentioned Martin once or twice, but he'd shut down if I asked questions. His whole body would go rigid, like he was physically fighting something inside. It was like he was protecting some secret, but it ate at him piece by piece. Grace felt her heart tighten, recognizing the familiar ache of secrets kept too long. I understand this is difficult, Rachel, but I need to know the truth. For everyone's sake. Rachel shook her head firmly, wrapping her arms around herself like a shield. Whatever Thomas's demons were, they died with him in that factory. Please don't drag them back up. Some things are better left buried. Grace nodded slowly, though her mind was already racing with possibilities, connecting invisible dots. She gathered her purse from the counter, knowing she'd learned all she could for now. As she headed toward the door, Rachel's words echoed in her ears, a warning she couldn't quite heed. The truth, Grace knew, had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. The evening sun cast long shadows through the foundation's windows as Grace organized materials for the upcoming fundraiser, her fingers methodically sorting through brochures and donor forms. The sound of pencils scratching on paper drew her attention to the break room, where Aaron sat hunched over a sketchbook, his face scrunched in concentration, the tip of his tongue poking out slightly between his lips. "Aaron, I didn't expect to see you here," Grace said warmly, setting down the stack of papers she'd been holding. He looked up, his expression brightening like a cloud passing from the sun. "Mom's cleaning the offices upstairs. She said I could wait here instead of outside. It's getting pretty cold out there." Grace pulled up a chair beside him, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor. "May I see what you're working on?" Aaron nodded eagerly, sliding his sketchbook toward her, his small hands still smudged with graphite. The pages were filled with intricate designs, each one more detailed than the last, showing a talent well beyond his years. "This one's inspired by the foundation building," he explained, pointing to an architectural drawing that captured the building's Victorian charm with surprising accuracy. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by Rachel's voice drifting from the adjacent office where she was cleaning, the sound of a vacuum cleaner cutting off abruptly. Grace excused herself to speak with her, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Rachel, about Thomas's struggles," Grace began in hushed tones, glancing over her shoulder to ensure they were alone. "Martin might have been connected to—" "What about my dad?" Aaron burst through the doorway, his face flushed with anger and betrayal. His sketchbook clutched tightly against his chest like a shield. "You're talking about him behind my back?" "Aaron, honey," Rachel started, reaching for him, but he cut her off with a sharp step backward. "No, you're just like everyone else," he shouted at Grace, tears welling in his eyes, his small frame trembling with emotion. "You think because we're poor, you can fix us. Because you feel sorry for us." Rachel's composed facade cracked, pain etching itself across her features. "Aaron, please." "Why are you letting her do this, Mom?" Aaron demanded, his voice breaking. "She's just digging around in our lives because she feels guilty or something." Rachel's shoulders tensed as she turned to Grace, her cleaning cloth twisted between her fingers. "He's right. You keep pushing and pushing. You can't save everyone, Grace. The words hung heavy in the air like storm clouds. Grace felt her chest tighten, each breath a struggle. "I only wanted to help," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Aaron was already running out the door, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and a crushing silence between the two women. Rachel wouldn't meet Grace's eyes, and the space between them felt vast and insurmountable, filled with unspoken words and broken trust. The grand ballroom of the Portland Hilton sparkled with elegant decorations as donors and foundation supporters mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. Soft classical music drifted through the air, while waiters glided past with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. Grace adjusted her navy blazer and smoothed her dark hair, watching Rachel help Aaron straighten his borrowed tie. Despite the lingering tension from their argument earlier that day, they had all agreed to attend tonight's fundraiser for the sake of the foundation's future. Grace took a deep breath and approached the polished wooden podium, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The room fell silent as she tapped the microphone, the gentle feedback drawing all eyes to her. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Before we begin our regular programming, I'd like to announce a new initiative." She paused, making eye contact with Aaron in the crowd, seeing his nervous fidgeting with his sleeve cuffs. The Mitchell Memorial Foundation is proud to introduce the Thomas Carter Scholarship for aspiring artists and designers. This program will support young creators who, like Thomas, face obstacles in pursuing their dreams. Grace's voice softened as she continued, her words carrying emotion that made the room grow still. Thomas Carter was a man who persevered through hardship, who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, and who inspired his son to see beauty in the world around him. To everyone's surprise, Aaron stood up and walked toward the stage, his dress shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. "May I say something?" he asked quietly, looking up at Grace with determined eyes. Grace nodded, stepping aside to let him speak. Aaron's hands trembled slightly as he faced the crowd, but his voice was steady and clear in the hushed room. "My dad taught me that broken things aren't worthless," Aaron began, his fingers unconsciously touching his collar. He would bring home discarded items from work, bent wire, loose beads, broken chains. We'd sit together at our kitchen table and turn them into something new. He pulled out the silver necklace from under his collar, holding it up so it caught the light. He showed me that with creativity and patience, you can make something beautiful out of what others throw away. The audience listened intently as Aaron spoke about his designs and dreams, his words painting pictures of late-night crafting sessions and his father's gentle encouragement. Several donors wiped away tears with embroidered handkerchiefs, deeply moved by his sincerity and passion. From her spot near the back wall, Rachel watched her son with pride, her earlier resistance softening as she witnessed the impact of the evening. Her eyes glistened as she saw the way people responded to Aaron's words. Donation pledges began flowing in immediately after Aaron's speech, with several attendees specifically requesting their contributions go to the Thomas Carter Scholarship, their checkbooks appearing as quickly as their tissues had moments before. As the event wound down, Grace found Aaron examining his necklace by the dessert table, running his fingers over its familiar patterns while nibbling on a chocolate-dipped strawberry. He looked up as she approached, offering a small smile that reached his eyes for the first time that evening. "Maybe you're not so bad after all," he said, his earlier anger replaced with cautious acceptance. A smudge of chocolate at the corner of his mouth made him seem younger, more vulnerable. Grace chuckled, feeling the weight of their previous confrontation lifting slightly. The simple statement held more promise than any elaborate speech could have conveyed, and she felt a warm spark of hope for their future relationship. Grace's heels clicked against the hardwood floors as she entered her darkened house, still buzzing from the fundraiser's success. The evening had gone better than she'd hoped. Aaron's speech touched hearts, and Rachel's subtle nod of approval meant everything. Her feet ached after hours of standing and mingling with donors, and she gratefully slipped off her shoes. She was about to head upstairs when her phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the peaceful silence. "Paul?" she answered, noting the late hour. A knot formed in her stomach at the unexpected call. "What did you find?" "Grace, you might want to sit down for this." Paul's voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of unwelcome news. "I've been digging deeper into Thomas Carter's background, and something isn't adding up. There are inconsistencies I can't explain away. Grace sank into her favorite armchair, her celebration mood evaporating like morning mist. The soft leather cushions seemed to cradle her suddenly tense body. What do you mean? I found his original birth certificate, the name on it. It's Thomas Marshall, not Carter. The dates and locations. They don't match what we thought we knew about his connection to your family. I've double-checked everything 3 times. Grace's hand trembled as she gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. That's impossible. Martin's records clearly suggested— I know, Paul interrupted softly, but the documentation is solid. Thomas Marshall became Thomas Carter sometime in his 20s. There's no blood relation to your family that I can find. Not a single connection I can verify. The room seemed to spin as Grace processed this information, the shadows in the corners growing deeper. All her theories, all her careful connections, they were crumbling like a house of cards. She thought of Aaron's bright smile at the fundraiser, of Rachel's slowly thawing demeanor. The memory of their faces made her chest tighten. Had she dragged them into this based on nothing but wishful thinking? I need to verify a few more details, Paul continued, his voice thick with concern. Maybe we should pause the investigation until— No, Grace said firmly, though her voice shook. Her free hand clenched into a fist. There has to be more. Martin wouldn't have kept those records, created that necklace design for no reason. Keep looking, Paul. Please. After hanging up, Grace made her way to her study, her bare feet silent against the floor. The necklace lay on her desk where she'd left it that morning, its silver surface catching the moonlight streaming through the window. She picked it up with trembling fingers, running them over the intricate design that had started this whole journey. The metal felt cool against her skin, almost accusatory in its mysteries. If Thomas wasn't my brother, she whispered to the empty room, her words barely audible, then who was he to Martin? What aren't you telling me? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Grace stared at the necklace that now seemed to hold even more mysteries than before. The moonlight cast strange shadows across its surface, as if the piece itself was keeping secrets she had yet to uncover. Grace stood in Rachel's modest kitchen, helping to clear away the dinner dishes. The smell of pasta and garlic bread still lingered in the air as she carefully approached the subject she'd been avoiding all evening. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the plates, trying to find the right words. The fundraiser was a huge success, Grace said, placing a plate in the sink and running the water. Aaron's speech really moved people. Several donors mentioned how touched they were by his story. Rachel nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. That's good to hear. She methodically wiped down the counter, keeping her gaze fixed on the task. Aaron sat at the small dining table, sketching in his notebook. His pencil moved rapidly across the page, creating intricate patterns that Grace couldn't quite make out. She noticed his head tilt slightly when she spoke again, his shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. Rachel, there's something else I need to discuss with you, Grace began hesitantly, her fingers fidgeting with a dish towel. About Thomas. Paul found some inconsistencies in his records. Aaron's pencil stopped moving, the silence suddenly deafening in the small kitchen. What do you mean inconsistencies? Rachel asked, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the fabric. The timeline doesn't add up. His background, his connection to my family. It's not what we thought. There are details that don't make sense. Aaron's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up abruptly, his sketchbook falling to the ground. You're still digging into our lives? His voice cracked with emotion, betrayal written across his young face. I thought you were different. Aaron, please. Rachel reached for him, but he backed away, bumping into the table. No. Aaron's face flushed red, tears welling in his eyes. You're not helping us. You're just trying to fix your past. We're not your charity case or your mystery to solve. Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. That's not true, Aaron. I care about you both. You have to believe that. Stop lying, Aaron shouted, his hands balled into fists. You don't care about us. You just care about solving your stupid puzzle. He grabbed his backpack from the floor and bolted for the door, leaving his sketchbook behind. Aaron, wait, Rachel called after him, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Rachel whirled on Grace, her eyes blazing with maternal fury. "You had no right to drag us into this. None." Her voice trembled with fury and fear, tears streaming down her face. "My son is out there somewhere because you couldn't leave well enough alone." Grace pulled out her phone with shaking hands, her stomach churning with guilt. "I'll call my foundation team. We'll find him, Rachel. I promise. We won't stop until we do." Within an hour, Grace had mobilized a search party. Foundation volunteers distributed flyers, while others contacted local shelters and youth centers. The rain started falling, first as a gentle mist, then harder, pattering against car windows as Grace drove through downtown Portland's darkening streets. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white with tension as she scanned every alley and doorway. "I promised I wouldn't fail you," she whispered to herself, wiping away tears as the windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the increasing downpour. The streetlights cast long shadows as Grace drove through Portland's empty streets, her headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white, eyes scanning every corner, alley, and doorway for any sign of Aaron. The night had grown bitterly cold, and worry gnawed relentlessly at her stomach. She pulled into another shelter's parking lot, her third visit of the night. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed overhead as tired faces looked up when she showed Aaron's photo on her phone. No one had seen him, and each negative response made her heart sink a little lower. At the 24-hour diner on Morrison Street, Grace remembered Aaron mentioning how he liked to sketch there sometimes, saying the late-night crowd gave him interesting subjects to draw. The bell chimed as she entered, and warm coffee smells mixed with the aroma of fresh-baked pie filled the air. A waitress with graying hair pulled into a messy bun approached, wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron. "Have you seen this boy tonight?" Grace asked, showing the photo, her voice trembling slightly. The waitress studied it carefully, leaning in close. "No, hun, but I'll keep an eye out. Leave your number. I'll call if he shows up. Poor thing looks cold in that picture." Grace's next stop was the First Presbyterian Church, its stone walls looming against the night sky. The pastor, a kind-faced man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, listened patiently to her story, nodding with understanding. "Lost sheep always find their way back when the time is right," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll watch for him here. The Lord has a way of guiding them home." Her phone rang, Rachel's number flashing on the screen. Grace's heart jumped into her throat. "Grace," Rachel's voice cracked with emotion. "I'm sorry about earlier. I shouldn't have blamed you. I'm so scared. He's never done anything like this before." "We'll find him, Rachel. I promise I won't stop looking until he's home safe. Every minute we're getting closer." As if on cue, another call beeped through. Paul Turner. "Grace, got a tip. Someone saw a kid matching Aaron's description at Washington Park about 20 minutes ago. Said he was sitting by the fountain." Grace's tires squealed as she raced to the park, running every yellow light she dared. But when she arrived, the sprawling grounds were empty and silent, the playground equipment casting eerie shadows in the pre-dawn light. Only the distant sound of early morning birds broke the stillness. Now sitting in her parked car as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of sunrise, Grace felt exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She pulled out the necklace from her pocket, running her thumb over its familiar pattern, feeling each groove and ridge that Aaron had so carefully crafted. "Please be safe," she whispered, closing her eyes and clutching the necklace to her chest. "Please let us find you. We need you home." Grace rushed into the small church shelter, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the worn wooden floor, blues, reds, and golds dancing with each passing cloud. In the corner, Aaron sat hunched over a sketchbook, his oversized hoodie making him look smaller than usual, almost drowning in the fabric. The pastor, a gentle-faced man with silver hair and laugh lines around his eyes, touched Grace's arm. "Let me speak with you first," he said softly, leading her to his office with careful steps. Inside, surrounded by old books with cracked spines and the rich scent of fresh brewed coffee, The pastor explained how Aaron had arrived. He showed up around midnight, soaked to the bone from the rain. Wouldn't say much, but he's been drawing ever since. The pastor's kind eyes met Grace's, wisdom and understanding reflected in their depths. He's hurting, but he's not lost. Sometimes pain makes us run from the very people trying to help us. It's just the heart's way of protecting itself. Grace nodded, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. I never meant to cause him more pain, she whispered, her voice catching. Walking back into the main room, Grace approached Aaron slowly, like you might a wounded animal ready to bolt. His pencil moved across the paper in quick, angry strokes that seemed to channel all his hurt onto the page. Aaron, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. For everything. When he didn't respond, she continued, her words coming straight from her heart. This was never about guilt or fixing the past. I genuinely care about you and your mom, more than you know. Aaron's hand stilled mid-stroke, but he didn't look up, his shoulders rigid with tension. The pastor stepped forward, his voice warm and steady like a lighthouse in a storm. You know, there's an old story about a shepherd who had 100 sheep. When one went missing, he left the 99 to find it. Family isn't about blood, it's about showing up, about choosing to care even when it's hard. Grace knelt beside Aaron's chair, close enough to help, but not so close as to crowd him. I promise I'll stop pushing about Thomas if that's what you want. Your friendship means more to me than answers about the past. So much more. Aaron finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear, like the sky after a storm. He didn't smile, but some of the tension left his shoulders, melting away like frost in morning sun. After a long moment that seemed to stretch between them, he gave a small nod. Let's get you home, Grace said softly, relief washing over her. Your mom's worried sick about you. As they walked toward the door, the pastor placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder, stopping her for just a moment. Sometimes, he said with a knowing smile that reached all the way to his eyes, the ones we try to save end up saving us instead. That's how healing works, it goes both ways. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically as Grace drove through Portland's drizzly streets. Aaron sat quietly in the passenger seat, his sketchbook clutched tightly to his chest as he stared out the window. Grace kept sneaking glances at him, her hands gripping the steering wheel a bit too tightly, searching for the right words. As they turned onto Rachel's street, Aaron's voice broke through the silence, barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to make everyone worry. I just needed space. Grace let out a small breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I understand, Aaron. Really, I do. She pulled into a parking spot and turned off the engine. I know I pushed too hard trying to figure everything out about your dad. That wasn't fair to you or your mom. Aaron picked at a loose thread on his hoodie. You just wanted answers. Yes, but not at the cost of hurting you. Grace turned to face him fully. From now on, I'm just here to support you and your mom. No strings attached, no hidden agendas. I promise. When they reached the apartment, Rachel flung open the door before they could knock. She wrapped Aaron in a fierce hug, tears streaming down her face. Don't you ever do that again, do you understand me? Her voice cracked with emotion as she held him tight. I'm sorry, Mom, Aaron mumbled into her shoulder, his own eyes getting wet. Rachel looked over Aaron's head at Grace, her expression a mix of gratitude and wariness. Thank you for finding him. She paused, then added firmly, but we've been through enough. Don't add to it. Grace nodded solemnly. I understand, Rachel. I'll respect your boundaries. Later, after Rachel had gone to bed, exhausted from worry, Grace found Aaron sitting at the kitchen table. She pulled out the sketch of the necklace he'd made and placed it gently in front of him. You kept it? He asked, running his fingers over the paper. Of course. You really think I'm good at this? His voice held a hint of hope. Grace smiled warmly. You're more than good. You're gifted. Aaron ducked his head, but Grace caught the small smile playing at his lips. He pulled out his notebook and began to sketch, the soft scratching of his pencil filling the comfortable silence. Grace settled into a nearby chair with a book, content to simply be present in this moment of quiet healing. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Grace's office as Paul Turner spread documents across her desk. His usually composed demeanor showed hints of excitement as he arranged the papers in a careful timeline. "I've found something significant, Grace," Paul said, his voice measured. "Thomas Carter wasn't your brother at all. He was Martin's half-brother." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "What?" Paul pointed to several documents. "Your father-in-law had an affair with a young woman who worked at his company. Thomas was born in 1970, but the relationship was kept quiet. I found birth records, old employment files, and even a few photographs." Grace sank into her chair, her mind racing. Martin's father, I never knew. She thought of the sealed envelope in Martin's desk, his cryptic words about protecting the family legacy. Everything was starting to make horrible sense. "There's more," Paul continued, sliding forward another document. "Thomas and Martin worked together briefly at Mitchell Enterprises. It seems Martin tried to help him, gave him a position, but something went wrong. The necklace Aaron has? According to company records, Martin gave it to Thomas just before he left the company. It appears to have been some kind of peace offering." Grace's hands trembled as she picked up an old employee photo. Thomas's face stared back at her, younger but unmistakable. She could see the family resemblance now, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intense eyes. "Martin knew," she whispered. "He knew and never told me." Paul nodded sympathetically. "From what I can piece together, Martin struggled with how to handle the situation. He tried to help Thomas quietly, but their relationship was complicated. The company records show tension between them." Grace felt tears welling up. The weight of Martin's secret pressed down on her chest. She thought of Thomas, living with the knowledge that his own family had rejected him, and of Aaron, unknowingly carrying his father's pain. "We need to be careful with this information," Paul advised gently, "especially with Rachel and Aaron. This kind of revelation could bring up a lot of hurt." Grace made her way to her study, clutching the file of documents. She sat heavily in her chair, looking up at Martin's photograph on the wall. His familiar smile seemed different now, tinged with sadness and secrets. "You tried to fix it," she whispered to the photo, "but it wasn't enough. Now it's my turn." The afternoon light cast long shadows across Grace's living room as she arranged teacups with trembling hands. Her fingers fumbled with the delicate china, betraying her nerves. Rachel and Aaron sat awkwardly on her plush sofa, both looking uncertain about why they'd been invited. Their eyes darted around the carefully decorated room, taking in the tasteful artwork and family photos. "I need to tell you something about Thomas," Grace began, her voice gentle but firm. She perched on the edge of her armchair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We've discovered that he was Martin's half-brother." Rachel's teacup clattered against its saucer, spilling drops of amber liquid onto the pristine white porcelain. "What did you say?" Grace explained everything, the affair, the secrecy, and Martin's attempts to make amends through the necklace. Her words came carefully, measured with compassion. As she spoke, Rachel's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age her before Grace's eyes. "All those years," Rachel whispered, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "He carried that weight alone. He never told me why he felt so outside of everything." Aaron sat forward, his young face serious, shoulders tense with concern. "But why didn't Uncle Martin just tell everyone? Why keep it a secret?" "Martin thought he was protecting his family's reputation," Grace admitted, feeling the familiar ache of regret. "It wasn't right, but he tried to make amends in his own way. The necklace was his attempt to acknowledge Thomas as family." Rachel wiped away a tear with the back of her hand, leaving a slight smudge of mascara. "Thomas wore that necklace every day. He said it reminded him that beauty could come from broken things." She took a deep breath that seemed to shake her whole body. "Maybe it's time we stop carrying his pain and start living for ourselves." Aaron had been quiet, processing everything, his fingers absently picking at a loose thread on his jeans. Finally, he looked at Grace with eyes that seemed older than his years, filled with a wisdom that made her heart ache. If Dad forgave Martin enough to accept that necklace, maybe I can too. Grace felt her heart swell with hope, warm and bright as the sunlight streaming through her windows. I want both of you involved in the Foundation's future, she said, leaning forward earnestly. We can honor Thomas's memory together, in ways that acknowledge his whole story. They sat together in the warm afternoon light, three people connected by a complex web of love, loss, and forgiveness. Rachel reached for her son's hand, squeezing it gently. The weight of secrets and shame began to lift, replaced by the possibility of something new and healing. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the trees, as if nature itself was sighing with relief. The morning sun streamed through the Foundation's conference room windows as Grace stood before her team. Her hands were steady now, her voice clear and purposeful. Thomas Carter's story has shown us that talent can emerge from unexpected places, she said, gesturing to the presentation screen behind her. That's why we're launching the Carter Mentorship Initiative. Around the large oak table, board members nodded approvingly. Aaron sat near the front, his sketchbook open, occasionally glancing up with pride when Grace mentioned his father's name. Rachel, Grace turned to face her, I'd like you to manage this program. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable. Rachel straightened in her chair, her eyes widening. Me? But I've never… You've been managing the impossible for years, Grace said softly. This is just putting those skills to better use. Aaron grinned at his mother. Plus, you'll have me to keep you on track, he teased, earning a gentle swat on the arm from Rachel. The tension broken, Aaron stood up and walked to the front. His confidence had grown remarkably in recent weeks. He flipped open his sketchbook, showing the team his designs for the mentorship program's logo and materials. I was thinking we could include art workshops, he explained, pointing to his sketches. Not everyone learns the same way. Sometimes drawing helps you figure things out when words don't work. Grace watched as Rachel joined her son at the front, adding her own practical suggestions about scheduling and resource management. The two of them moved naturally through their presentation, building on each other's ideas. In that moment, Grace felt something shift inside her. The weight of unresolved questions and hidden truths seemed to lift. Martin and Thomas's complicated legacy had transformed into something beautiful, a bridge between past and future, pain and possibility. As Aaron and Rachel continued their presentation, Grace sat quietly, watching them work together. Their enthusiasm filled the room, bringing new life to the Foundation's mission. In their voices, she heard echoes of both Martin's creativity and Thomas's resilience, finally united in purpose rather than divided by secrets. The afternoon light filled the conference room as Grace carefully placed the silver necklace in the center of the polished oak table. Board members, staff, and most importantly, Rachel and Aaron, gathered around with anticipation. This necklace, Grace began, her voice warm and steady, represents more than just a connection between families. It's about hope, resilience, and the power of creating something beautiful from life's challenges. Aaron sat up straighter in his chair, his eyes fixed on the necklace gleaming under the overhead lights. That's why we're calling our new mentorship program Threads of Hope, Grace announced, smiling at Aaron. Because sometimes the strongest connections in our lives come from unexpected places. Aaron raised his hand tentatively. I've been working on something, he said, pulling out his sketchbook. Maybe we could use the necklace design as our logo? I made some changes to make it more… us. Grace walked over to examine Aaron's work. The sketch maintained the original design's essence, but incorporated modern elements that represented growth and connection. Her eyes misted as she studied the details. It's perfect, she said softly. Absolutely perfect. Rachel cleared her throat, her confidence growing with each passing day at the Foundation. I'd like to propose something too, she said. Many families like ours struggle with more than just finances. What if we included workshops on emotional healing and financial literacy? The Foundation team nodded enthusiastically, and one board member immediately pledged additional funding. Others followed suit, inspired by the program's potential impact. As the meeting progressed, Grace watched Aaron working quietly in his corner, refining his logo design. His fingers moved confidently across the paper, adding subtle touches that brought the image to life. Later that afternoon, Aaron approached Grace's desk with his completed sketch. His hands trembled slightly as he handed it to her, but his eyes shone with pride. Grace examined the final design, taking in every careful detail. Without a word, she walked to her office wall and pulled down an old photograph. In its place, she hung Aaron's sketch in a simple silver frame. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on Aaron's shoulder. "And so am I." Aaron smiled, looking up at his work displayed prominently in Grace's office. The necklace design, once a symbol of hidden truths and painful memories, now represented something entirely new: hope for the future and the unbreakable threads that connected them all. Grace stood before her mirror, carefully fastening the silver necklace that had changed everything. Her fingers traced its familiar pattern, remembering that first day she'd seen Aaron selling his trinkets outside the foundation. The morning sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, making the metal gleam. A knock at the door announced Rachel's arrival. "Grace, are you ready?" Rachel called out, her voice full of excitement. "Coming!" Grace grabbed her purse and opened the door to find Rachel practically glowing with maternal pride. "Can you believe it?" Rachel said, smoothing her navy dress. "My boy's graduating, and valedictorian." Her eyes welled up. This past year, Aaron's grown so much. The foundation, the mentoring program. It gave him direction. Purpose. At the high school auditorium, Grace and Rachel found their seats in the front row. The ceremony began, and when Aaron took the podium for his speech, Grace felt her heart swell. "Life doesn't always give us what we expect," Aaron began, his voice steady and clear. "Sometimes it takes things away, but it also gives us chances to build something new." He paused, looking directly at Grace and Rachel. "Hope is like a thread. It holds you together when everything else is falling apart." Grace dabbed at her eyes as Aaron continued speaking about perseverance and gratitude. Rachel squeezed her hand tight. When Aaron crossed the stage to receive his diploma, both women stood, cheering loudly. After the ceremony, Aaron led them through crowds of celebrating families, introducing them to his teachers and friends. "This is my mom," he'd say proudly, then with equal warmth, "and this is Grace." As the crowds thinned, Aaron pulled a small box from his graduation gown. "I have something for you, Grace." His hands shook slightly as he handed it to her. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, clearly crafted by Aaron himself. Grace lifted it carefully, reading the inscription. "Love isn't what we lose, it's what we choose to carry forward." The autumn breeze rustled through the foundation's courtyard as Aaron sat cross-legged on a bench, surrounded by 3 young children. His sketchbook lay open as he showed them how to turn simple shapes into meaningful designs. Grace watched from her office window, her heart swelling with pride. "See? Even a broken line can become something beautiful," Aaron explained, his voice carrying the same gentle patience that had touched Grace's heart years ago. Rachel appeared beside Grace, clipboard in hand. "He's a natural mentor," she said softly. "Just like you were with him." The 3 gathered in Grace's office later that afternoon, spreading papers across her desk as they discussed expanding the mentorship program. Aaron's enthusiasm was contagious as he sketched out ideas for new workshops, but Grace's expression grew serious as she pulled out the latest financial reports. "We're facing some challenges," she admitted, showing them the declining numbers. "Donor contributions have dropped significantly in the last quarter." Rachel's face tightened with concern, but Aaron's eyes lit up. "What if we did something different?" he suggested, already reaching for his sketchbook. "A fundraiser that shares stories like mine, like ours. We could call it Threads of Hope, Stories That Bind Us." Grace leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." Aaron quickly sketched as he spoke, his pencil flying across the paper. "We showcase personal stories of resilience, using art and design to bring them to life. The necklace design could be our symbol, connecting all these different threads of hope. Rachel nodded enthusiastically. I can help coordinate with the families we've worked with. Many of them want to give back. The foundation buzzed with renewed energy as they put the plan into motion. Grace worked the phones, reaching out to her network of supporters. Rachel organized teams of volunteers, while Aaron's designs began appearing on posters and social media. Late one evening, Grace found Aaron still at his desk, finalizing the last promotional materials. The office was quiet except for the soft scratch of his pencil. She sat beside him, taking in the beautiful artwork he'd created. "You've turned this into something bigger than any of us ever imagined," Grace said softly, placing her hand over his. Grace's hands trembled as she lifted the worn leather journal from the dusty storage box. The leather was cracked with age, and Martin's familiar scrawl filled its pages. She settled into her favorite armchair, taking a deep breath before opening it. The first entry she read made her chest tighten. "I saw Thomas today at the factory," Martin had written. "He looks so much like father, but his eyes hold such pain I wanted to reach out to explain everything, but the words wouldn't come." Grace called Rachel and Aaron, asking them to come to her home. When they arrived, she explained about finding the journal. "I think we all need to hear this," she said softly. They sat together in Grace's study as she read Martin's words aloud. "I gave Thomas the necklace today," one entry stated. "He didn't want to take it at first, but when I explained it was designed for my daughter, something in his expression changed. Maybe he understood that I was trying to say I saw him as family, even if I couldn't say the words out loud." Rachel wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. "Thomas never told me about receiving the necklace," she said, "but he wore it every day until—" Her voice trailed off. Aaron reached for his mother's hand. "Dad kept it close because it meant something to him," he said. "Even if he was angry, he must have understood what Martin was trying to say." Grace continued reading entries that revealed Martin's deep regret and his struggle to make amends. "I see Thomas's son sometimes," one entry read. "He has his father's creative spirit. I hope someday he'll know the truth and that our family's legacy of silence will end with me." Rachel's shoulders relaxed as she listened. "I spent years wondering if Thomas died bitter about your family," she admitted to Grace. "But this helps me understand. Yeah, maybe this was his way of telling us we don't have to carry his burdens anymore," Aaron said thoughtfully, running his fingers over the journal's worn pages. Grace closed the journal gently and walked to her desk. She placed it carefully beside Martin's photo, her fingers lingering on its leather cover. "We've finally found peace, Martin," she whispered. "Thank you." Sunlight streamed through the foundation office windows, casting a warm glow on the conference room table. Aaron, now 20 and carrying himself with quiet confidence, spread his sketchpad across the polished surface. His dark hair fell over his eyes as he leaned forward, eager to share his vision with Grace and Rachel. "I've been thinking about how to make this fundraiser different," Aaron said, flipping through pages filled with detailed drawings, "something that really shows what the foundation means to people." Grace sat beside Rachel, both women watching Aaron with pride. He'd grown so much from the guarded boy selling trinkets outside their building. His college education had only strengthened his natural talent for design. "See, we could transform the venue into a journey," Aaron explained, pointing to his sketches. "Each section tells a different family's story through art, photos, and recordings. The people we've helped become part of telling their own stories." Rachel leaned forward, her practical nature showing through. "That's a beautiful idea, honey, but coordinating all those elements—" She trailed off, concern creasing her forehead. Aaron smiled, the same determined look in his eyes that Grace had seen so many times before. "Mom, we've faced bigger challenges and we've always figured it out." The foundation staff rallied around Aaron's vision. Local artists volunteered their time, inspired by his enthusiasm. Even some of the younger mentorship participants offered to contribute artwork. Grace secured the perfect venue, an old warehouse with exposed brick walls and natural lighting that would showcase the installations beautifully. Rachel threw herself into coordinating with families. Her initial worries transformed into purposeful action. She worked tirelessly, helping people find the courage to share their stories of struggle and triumph. In the center of his sketchpad, Aaron had drawn the showpiece, a larger, more intricate version of Thomas's necklace. The design incorporated elements from multiple family stories, weaving them together into something new and powerful. "What do you think?" Aaron asked Grace, showing her the detailed sketch. His fingers traced the intricate patterns he'd created. Grace studied the design, emotion welling up in her throat. "You're making something beautiful out of something broken," she said softly. "That's the real legacy." Grace's hands trembled as she held the newspaper, her eyes scanning the damaging article. Rachel sat beside her in the foundation office, her face pale with anger and concern. The headline screamed, "Mitchell Foundation, profiting from pain?" "How dare they?" Rachel whispered, her voice tight. "They don't know anything about what we've done here." Before Grace could respond, Aaron walked in, his usual confident stride faltering as he noticed their expressions. His eyes fell to the newspaper, and his face drained of color as he read the headline. "Let me see it," he said quietly, reaching for the paper. Grace hesitated but handed it over. Aaron's eyes moved across the page, his jaw clenching with each paragraph. The article painted him as a victim of manipulation, suggesting Grace had exploited his family's tragedy for publicity. "This is my fault," Aaron said, dropping the paper on the desk. "I shouldn't have made this so personal. My story, the necklace. I gave them ammunition." Grace stood up immediately, her voice firm despite her shaking hands. "No, Aaron. Sharing your story was an act of courage, not exploitation. These people don't understand what we're building here." Rachel moved to her son's side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Grace is right. But maybe we should postpone the fundraiser until this blows over." "No," Grace said, straightening her spine. "We're going to face this head on. I'll call a press conference. We'll show them exactly who we are and what we stand for." Aaron nodded slowly, his initial shock giving way to determination. "I want to speak too. They used my story to attack us. I should be the one to set the record straight." Throughout the day, Grace worked on her speech, carefully crafting each word to defend their mission while maintaining dignity. Aaron sat nearby, adding his own thoughts and experiences to strengthen their message. Rachel focused her energy on calling each family participating in the fundraiser, offering reassurance and support. Most stood firmly behind the foundation, but a few expressed concerns about the publicity. As evening approached, Aaron looked up from the speech drafts scattered across the table. "This is bigger than me," he said firmly. "We can't let one article ruin everything we've worked for." Grace met his gaze, seeing the same resilience that had first drawn her to help him years ago. "That's courage, Aaron. Your father would be proud." The foundation's main conference room buzzed with tension as reporters filled every available seat. Camera flashes punctuated the air like lightning. Grace sat at the long table facing the crowd, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Aaron fidgeted beside her, tugging at his collar. From the corner of her eye, Grace could see Rachel standing near the doorway, arms crossed protectively over her chest. Grace approached the podium, adjusting the microphone with steady hands. Her voice, when it came, was clear and unwavering. "The Mitchell Foundation was born from loss," she began. "I lost my daughter before she drew her first breath. I lost my husband, Martin, 5 years ago. These weren't just personal tragedies. They were catalysts for change." The room fell silent as Grace continued, sharing the raw truth of her grief and how it led her to create something meaningful. Her voice cracked slightly when she spoke about finding Aaron and discovering the connection to Thomas. When Aaron took the podium, his initial nervousness melted away as he spoke from the heart. "Some people think we're sharing our pain for profit," he said, his young voice carrying across the hushed room. "But what we're really sharing is hope. My dad died when I was young. We struggled. But through the foundation, I found more than just help. I found purpose." One by one, families stepped forward to share their stories. A single mother who completed her degree through the foundation's scholarship program. A teenager who discovered his talent for art through their mentorship initiative. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a powerful narrative of transformation and hope. Reporters who had arrived with skeptical expressions now nodded in understanding. questions shifted from accusations to genuine interest in the Foundation's programs and future plans. As the press conference drew to a close, the applause was spontaneous and heartfelt. Aaron turned to Grace, his eyes bright with relief and pride. "I think we did it," he said simply. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of the past few days lifting from her shoulders. They had done more than defend their reputation. They had reinforced the very essence of what made their work meaningful. The warm glow of Grace's dining room lights cast a gentle ambiance as she, Rachel, and Aaron sat around the table. The remains of their shared meal, pasta with garlic bread, lingered before them. The tension that had gripped them during the press conference had melted away, replaced by an easy companionship. "It's going to be amazing, I can feel it," Aaron said, his eyes bright with excitement as he discussed the upcoming fundraiser. His hands moved animatedly as he spoke, nearly knocking over his water glass. Grace couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. She watched as Rachel automatically reached out to steady the glass, a mother's instinct that had become second nature. The simple gesture reminded Grace of how far they'd come from those first cautious meetings. "I need to thank you both," Grace said, her voice soft but sincere. "Rachel, for trusting me with your family, even when you had every reason not to, and Aaron, for showing me what real courage looks like." Rachel ducked her head, momentarily overwhelmed. When she looked up, her eyes were misty. "I was wrong about you, Grace. I thought you were just another rich person trying to ease their conscience. But you've become—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Your family now." "Does that mean I have two moms now?" Aaron quipped, breaking the emotional tension with perfect teenage timing. After they cleared the dishes, Aaron disappeared briefly and returned with a velvet-wrapped package. With careful hands, he unveiled the centerpiece necklace he'd designed for the fundraiser. The metalwork was intricate, combining elements of Thomas's original piece with Aaron's own artistic vision. Rachel's breath caught as she saw it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out to touch the delicate design. "It's like seeing your father's heart in silver," she whispered. "He would be so proud, Aaron." Grace studied the piece, noting how Aaron had managed to honor both Thomas's original design and Martin's influence while adding his own unique elements. "We should dedicate the event to both of them," she suggested. "To Martin and Thomas, two men who never truly knew each other but whose legacy brought us together." The three of them stood close, the necklace catching the light between them. Grace felt a profound sense of rightness as she said, "This is just the beginning. Together, we can build something that lasts forever." Sunlight streamed through the gallery's high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Aaron's hands trembled slightly as he positioned the centerpiece necklace on its custom-made pedestal. The piece was magnificent, a larger, more intricate version of his father's original design, crafted from silver and adorned with delicate gemstones that caught the morning light. "Perfect," Grace whispered, watching from a few feet away. Around them, Foundation staff bustled about, hanging photographs and arranging chairs for the evening's presentations. Rachel moved purposefully through the Family Stories exhibit, straightening frames and checking name cards. She paused to squeeze the shoulder of a nervous mother who would be speaking later. "Your story matters," Rachel assured her. "Just speak from your heart." Aaron stepped back from the pedestal, taking in the full effect. The necklace seemed to float in its display case, surrounded by soft lighting that highlighted every carefully crafted detail. His throat tightened as he thought about his father and the original piece that had started this journey. "This is for you, Dad," he whispered, touching the glass briefly before turning to join the others. The evening began with a powerful video presentation. Images of families helped by the Foundation filled the screen, accompanied by gentle music and testimonials. In the audience, tissues appeared as emotions ran high. When Aaron took the stage, his voice was clear and strong. "This necklace," he said, gesturing to the centerpiece, "represents more than just artistic design. It's a symbol of how broken pieces can be forged into something beautiful. It honors two men, Martin Mitchell and Thomas Carter, whose stories remind us of the power of hope." The audience sat captivated as Aaron explained the symbolism behind each element of the design. He spoke of resilience, of family bonds that transcend blood, and of the healing power of creativity. As applause filled the room, Erin stood proudly between Grace and Rachel. Donation pledges were already flooding in through the Foundation's website. Grace squeezed Erin's hand, tears of joy in her eyes. Rachel beamed with pride, her earlier doubts about the evening completely forgotten. The three of them stood together, united by something stronger than the past, a shared vision for the future, and the unbreakable threads of hope that bound them together. Grace stood in front of the Foundation's staff, her hands clasped together to hide their slight trembling. The morning sunlight filtered through the conference room windows, casting a warm glow across the familiar faces she'd worked with for years. "After much consideration," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I've decided it's time for me to step back from running the Foundation." Murmurs rippled through the room. Rachel sat up straighter in her chair, while Erin leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I believe," Grace continued, "that the Foundation needs fresh leadership to carry it forward. Rachel, I'd like you to take over as director." Rachel's eyes widened. "Grace, I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You are," Grace assured her with a warm smile. "You've shown incredible leadership these past months. The families trust you, and the staff respects you." Erin reached over and squeezed his mother's hand. "You've got this, Mom." Grace turned to Erin. "And you, Erin, I want you to oversee the mentorship program and its artistic initiatives. Your vision has already transformed how we reach people." "Really?" Erin's face lit up. "I mean, yes, absolutely." The Foundation staff began nodding in agreement, some offering words of support. Sarah from accounting spoke up. "We're excited to see where you both take us." "I'll stay on as an advisor," Grace added. "But it's time for new voices to lead. You've been running this in spirit for a while now. I'm just making it official." Rachel stood up, her initial hesitation giving way to determination. "We won't let you down, Grace." Later that afternoon, Grace began packing up her office. She carefully wrapped Martin's photo in tissue paper and placed it in a cardboard box. Next came the framed sketch of Erin's necklace design. She paused, running her fingers over the glass. "I think we did it, Martin," she whispered. "We found a way to heal old wounds and create something beautiful." Rachel appeared in the doorway. "Need help?" "No, I'm almost done," Grace replied, placing the frame in the box. "Just remembering." "You're sure about this?" Rachel asked. Grace nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. "More than sure. It's your time now." The grand ballroom of the Portland Art Museum buzzed with excitement. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over elegant table settings and striking art displays. Aaron Carter, now 32 and carrying himself with quiet confidence, moved through the space with practiced ease. His tailored suit couldn't hide the creative spirit that still marked him as an artist at heart. He paused to adjust one of the commemorative necklaces on display, each one telling a story of hope and resilience. The original design, his father's legacy, had evolved into dozens of variations, each created by young artists who'd found their voice through the Foundation's programs. Grace Mitchell entered the ballroom, her silver hair elegantly styled and her eyes bright with pride. Despite her 70 years, she moved with purpose, stopping to embrace familiar faces. Parents introduced their children, telling her how the Foundation had changed their lives. Former mentees, now successful professionals, shared stories of their journeys. Rachel took the podium, her voice strong and clear. "When Grace Mitchell first opened her heart to my son and me, we were broken," she said. "We didn't trust easily. But Grace showed us that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. It's about showing up day after day and believing in each other." The crowd applauded as Aaron stepped up to announce the new initiative. His voice carried his father's warmth and Grace's determination. "The Thomas Carter Art Scholarship," he declared, "will ensure that young artists never have to choose between their dreams and their survival." He turned to Grace, his eyes shining. "Because one woman taught me that creativity isn't just about making beautiful things. It's about healing hearts and building bridges." The tribute video played on large screens showing Grace's journey from grieving widow to reluctant mentor to beloved foundation matriarch. Photos of Martin and Thomas appeared, reminding everyone of the two men whose story had started it all. As the evening drew to a close, Aaron approached Grace with the original necklace, the one that had first connected their families. With gentle hands, he fastened it around her neck. "Dad's courage started this," he said softly. "You carried it forward, now it's my turn." Grace looked around the room, taking in the faces of hundreds whose lives had been touched by the foundation. Young artists displayed their work proudly. Parents hugged their children. Former mentees chatted with current students, passing on the legacy of hope. "We did it, Martin," she whispered, touching the necklace that had started it all. If you enjoyed the story of the Grace, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.